at least attempted to talk about the Christian worldview regarding the timelessness of God. I guess we move on to day one of creation. And yeah, I mean, I guess it describes Earth without form, void, darkness. It's in verse 2 of the first chapter in the Bible, Genesis 1, verse 2. So again, I'm going to give you the ground here to kind of take me through what happened in day one. Was Earth already a thing? Because it's described as something without form, that's void, that's dark, but it also says in the same verse, the Spirit of God hovering over the face of the waters. So was Earth just this, I guess, the precursor to the Earth we know today, with oceans, land, animals, things like that? Was and during day one of creation, was Earth just a watery void, or was that like what was Earth at this point?
Yeah, so we kind of probably need to establish a couple of ground principles, I think, about this chapter. One is, it's a well-established doctrine in Orthodox theology. It's not just something that, radicals thought up in theology, that God accommodates his communication to the ability of his listeners, you could say readers of Scripture in this case, to handle, and to, in some ways, to the comprehension of the time. Augustine, the church father I mentioned, he is one church father who has an important teaching on accommodation, thinks this through. Amongst the reformers, John Calvin has a well thought through teaching on accommodation, and this idea that, while we're babies, God whispers to us in baby talk, so he lowers his communication level to the point that we can understand. How that affects Genesis 1 is it means that Genesis 1 communicates to its audience and through its writer in terms that they understood. If we would have Genesis 1 written today, for instance, I don't think there would be any talk of what traditionally was called the firmament or the interface of day 2. I actually don't think that would feature in the conversation if God were to reveal this account as Scripture in our present day. But in the world in which it was born, that was really necessary. So I think it's important to realize that the way God communicates creation in the Scripture of Genesis 1, 2, and 3 is necessarily accommodated to what people understood the cosmos and unseen reality to be. Now, most Bible readers with training would understand that day 1 of creation begins with chapter 1, verse 3. And so that leaves us with a couple of options. Two of the main ones are that Genesis 1, 1:1, God created the heavens and the earth, is the first step, the very first action of creation that God took. And then the formless earth of verse 2 would be the first product, as if to say God creates the original matter in its most blank form and then begins to work with it, creates the clay and then molds the clay. An alternative that I'm sympathetic to is to understand in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth as kind of a headline statement that actually covers everything that's going to follow down to Genesis 2:3, a summary statement, working like a headline would or a heading in a modern text. Mm-hmm. And therefore that Genesis 1:2 is essentially a starting state. That's the blank beginning before any creative work is done. I actually think that's probably the best way to understand the language. And then people sometimes, once they comprehend that, then they'll say, oh, so in the beginning there were two things, God and this kind of, blank matter, but it was something. I actually think that Genesis 1:2 describes the nothingest thing the writer could think of. Right? I actually think the idea of a complete void or vacuum had not entered the conversation, and it was not there as an accessible concept. I think this formless and void eretz, this formless and void earth, was the blankest, emptiest, most null category that was available to talk about. And so I think functionally or practically, it is creation out of nothing. But
Mhm.
we sometimes bring our concept of a vacuum, or, you know, even something more nothing than a vacuum, to the conversation and say, well, it was clearly something, not nothing. As far as the writer was concerned, I think it's as nothing as he knew how to get to. And therefore, I don't see a problem. I don't think you can prove creation out of nothing from Genesis 1, but I think you can't contradict creation out of nothing from Genesis 1 either. So I think that everything that
Mhm.
follows in the 6 days where something is done all comes under the heading of creating heavens and earth. And then
Mhm.
it's probably worth, I can either stop, or I wouldn't mind making some global statements about the whole creation week as a whole before talking about the days. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, do whatever you need. Yeah.
Mm. So it's interesting. Well, I think the key to understanding the creation week is what needs to happen is life needs to be possible. The end goal that you get to on day 6 is a world full of willing beings, human beings, capable of relationship with God. So that's kind of the goal of this first episode of the biblical drama. But to get
Mhm.
there, the world, the cosmos needs to be life friendly. And while it's an undistinguished blank, while there's nothing that's not something else, life is not possible. It has no zones to live in, and there's no living creatures. And so, a little bit like mitosis from a cell, you know, when a cell is fertilized and it begins to divide, this is what the creation week early on is like, that things start to be distinguished from one another. Things that were all melded start to be separated. And so on day 2, instead of just, again, water is like the blankest thing you could sort of describe, and the most amorphous, the most formless. Oh, suddenly you have waters above and below, and we have a zone in between. We have some kind of a space that begins to look possible for life, right? At least there's somewhere for it to
Mhm.
go. And day 3, you've got another distinction. It's like mitosis again. It's like another splitting of the cells. And now
Mhm.
the below level has distinction in it. It's not just undifferentiated water. It's land and sea. And now you have enough spaces to start to populate things. And then
Mhm.
days 4 to 6, in some sense, go back and populate the spaces that have been created. There's now zones where different entities, including sun, moon, and stars, not living in the sense that we would think of living, but different entities of creation now have somewhere to go. And each of those zones needs to be populated and actually really kind of teeming with creatures. So the end of
Mhm.
the creation week is that you have a cosmos that's doesn't have one or two isolated, lonely creatures. It's just kind of swarming and teeming, as if God likes
Mhm.
each of these zones to be full of their suitable life. Oceans,
Mhm.
skies, even the cosmos, and the land, with land creatures and then humans.
So are you saying that well, what I understood from what you just said is essentially creation came from nothing. Out of the nothingness, God essentially, how do you say, manipulated certain things to, I guess, support life and stable life for creatures and ultimately human beings.
Hmm. Yeah, this kind of raises one more question, one more kind of global or foundational question, and that
Mm-hmm.
is, are we reading regular history that narrates events in sequence as they happen? Um, Lots of scholars don't think so. Lots of scholars essentially think that the sequence of the days is a device that lets you talk about the different categories of creation, and that there's no possibility, if you were to go backwards in a time machine and kind of be a fly on the wall, you wouldn't see the content of these days unfold in order in history. Right? I
Mm.
suspect that's true myself. One quite conservative Christian scholar called C. John Collins wrote an article, probably 30 years ago now, and he talked about anthropomorphic days in Genesis 1. So maybe it's worth visiting the Eden story, in Genesis 2 and 3 for a moment, and as soon as we read that, we realize, oh, creation in this garden narrative is definitely picturing God anthropomorphically. Like occasionally you'll see Sunday school type pictures where God actually makes the first human being with his hands out of clay. But as you said, quite rightly, God is not measured by the kind of dimensions that you can measure with a 2-meter ruler. And so the idea of God molding the first human as a potter does, it's a metaphor. It's a figure of speech. You could say it's an anthropomorphism because it pictures what God does in terms of what humans do in a corresponding way.
Right. Yeah. So kind of giving it a human quality for us to relate to or something, right?
Right, which is this accommodation at work, right? This condescension in God's communication. Well, the argument is that in quite a different style, Genesis 1 actually does the same thing with the construction of the cosmos by picturing it almost like a building project that you and I would understand, and not one of our houses, but maybe an ancient house, you know, with concerted effort could be erected in about a week, you know, and it kind of it pictures God's construction of creation as if it was a human construction project over about that span of time. Now, we see in other parts of Scripture that sequences of days can be used as a figure of speech. You know, the prophet Hosea kind of pictures Israel as saying, oh, you know, God's going to restore us after 2 days, and after 3 days he's going to build us up. And it would be clearly a mistaken understanding to try and interpret that as a prophecy that actually 2 days later, after the time the people spoke, that's when they expected things to be fixed, you know. It's a figure of time for this is going to take a little while, figure of speech. It's going to take a little while, but it won't take forever, and God's going to act on our behalf. So in one sense, we're not saying the days are anything else. You know, are they 24-hour days with day and night? Yes, they are. Are they an actual historical narrative of the way this cosmos came to be? No, they aren't, it wouldn't seem. Now, I kind of respect the right of some Christians who are going to say, look, don't overcomplicate this. The narrative says 7 days. It's staring us in the face. Don't try and make it too fancy, you know. Don't try and be too clever. Okay, you know, I'm all right with that. But I feel as if I can't figure out any way in which the things that I think I know about the natural world can be explained in terms of construction of 7 days and then a dramatic flood sometime later. But I actually already think I don't have to, because I think the ways of God are being pictured on the analogy of the ways of human beings.
Okay.
So therefore it makes it a null question for me, like a kind of a nonsense question. How long are the days in geological time? Or, you know, are they 1,000 years? Are they 1,000,000 years? Or, you know, are they 24 hours? I actually think it's a misguided question, because we're trying to unpack the strands of a metaphor and turn it into, you know, a historical narrative, basically.
So do you think when people ask you, oh, are the days literally 7 days, 6 days of creation? Was it literally 168 hours? So for you, those questions are kind of like red herrings that divert you from the actual task at hand, which is to understand how God worked and how human beings came to be. That's your view?
Yes, you could say that. Yep. So you know, I'm not saying they're not literal days. I'm just saying the whole idea of the week is all a schematic, you know, it's accommodated speech for our benefit.